You can sleep on the couch, or better yet, get a hotel room. Those words hit harder than they should have. Cora, my daughter-in-law, stood in my living room like she owned the place. Hands on her hips, chin lifted just enough to make it clear who she thought was in charge. Behind her, her parents hovered near the kitchen, surveying the place like potential buyers at an open house. "You'd better leave," her father added, his tone sharp and dismissive. "We won't have enough room for 5. I stood there for a long second, unsure if I'd misheard. My morning walk had ended just minutes before. My water bottle still dangled from my hand, half empty, my old sneakers leaving faint prints on the tile floor. But as I looked around my living room, I realized nothing about this scene was normal. The furniture was shifted, boxes stacked by the wall. My framed family photos, gone, replaced by some tasteless painting of a boat at sunset that looked like it came straight from a thrift store bin. "Excuse me?" I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on here?" "Oh," Cora said lightly, brushing dust from her jeans. "You're back already. We were just getting things arranged." "Arranged?" I repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means," her mother chimed in from the hallway, "we're moving in. Neil said it was fine." My son appeared just then carrying a box labeled "Kitchen" in thick black marker. His face was red, not from the Arizona heat, but from the weight of whatever guilt he was carrying. He avoided my eyes. "Dad," he said, shifting the box awkwardly, "can we talk outside?" "Sure," I replied, but I didn't move. I kept looking at Cora and her parents, standing there as if this house were their stage and I had interrupted rehearsal. My stomach twisted. This house wasn't just a roof and 4 walls. It was my late wife's pride. We bought it 32 years ago, the year Neil was born. I painted every wall myself. I fixed the roof twice, once during monsoon season when the rain came through the attic vent. Every corner held some piece of our story, and now it looked like an Airbnb. Outside, Neil set the box down and rubbed the back of his neck. Over, to people assuming I'd given up control of my own life. But there's a difference between kindness and being invisible. Cora must have seen the look on my face when I walked back inside, because she immediately spoke up. "Don't take it the wrong way," she said. "It's just for a few weeks. We'll handle the bills and groceries while they're here." I looked around again. Her father was sprawled on my couch, scrolling on his phone. Her mother had already claimed the kitchen island, unboxing some crystal dishes. My coffee table had been shoved aside, and my recliner, my only real piece of comfort, was gone. "Where's my chair?" I asked. "Oh," Cora said. "We moved it to the garage. It didn't match the rest of the furniture." That's when it hit me. This wasn't temporary. They weren't staying for a while. They were taking over. Her father looked up from his phone long enough to say, "Don't worry, old man. We'll keep things running smoothly. You just relax." Old man. I should have said something then. Should have drawn a line right there in the living room. But instead, I nodded once and went upstairs. My late wife's photo hung on the wall near the landing. I paused there for a moment, staring into her calm, steady eyes. "I'm sorry, Maria," I whispered. "I didn't see this coming." I packed a single duffel bag, just clothes, toiletries, my wedding ring, and the small wooden box that held her ashes. I didn't slam the door on my way out. I didn't say goodbye. I just left. Shields. I rented a small apartment on the other side of town, near an old golf course that had turned into a dog park. It wasn't much, just a 1-bedroom with squeaky floors and a view of the dumpsters, but it was quiet, peaceful. Silence. For the first few days, I tried convincing myself I'd done the right thing. Neil had always been soft-spoken, easily swayed. Maybe Cora really did need to help her parents for a short time. Maybe I'd overreacted. But then the neighbors started calling. First it was Jerry from across the street. "Hey, Pete," he said. "Saw a few cars parked in your driveway all night. You rent the place out or something?" Contentious. "No," I said slowly. "Why?" "Well, looks like they've been throwing. Dad's been doing some yard work. You'll love how it looks when it's done." "Yard work," I repeated. "He's cutting down my mesquite tree?" Yeah, she said. It blocked the view of the house. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. That tree had been there since before Neil was born. I planted it myself. Cora, I said quietly, you and I need to talk. Silence. Oh, I'd love to, but we're actually having some of my parents' friends over tonight. Maybe tomorrow? She hung up before I could respond. That night, I drove by the house. I didn't go in. I just parked across the street and watched. The lights glowed through the blinds. Laughter spilled out the open windows. My driveway was lined with cars I didn't recognize. My mailbox now had a small label over my name. The Richards family. I don't remember the last time I felt that kind of betrayal. Not from strangers, from my own family. Neil had always been quiet but good-hearted. He'd never talked back, never caused trouble. I'd paid for his college, helped him with the down payment on his first car, even loaned him money for his wedding. All I'd ever asked was that he take care of the things that mattered, his family, his integrity, and this house. And now I realized I'd given all of that to the wrong people. The next morning I woke up early and went for a walk. The February air was cool, crisp, the kind that wakes up your lungs. I thought better when I moved. One step, then another, my shoes crunching on gravel. I walked for an hour, letting the anger drain into something calmer, sharper. By the time I rounded the last corner, I'd made a decision. They wanted me gone? Fine, I'd leave. But I wouldn't be silent. Immigration at them hang themselves with their own arrogance first. Then, when the time was right, I'd remind them exactly whose name was on every bill, every document, every inch of that property. Strings, the deed, the utilities, the HOA registration, the insurance, everything. And when it all came crashing down, they'd have no one to blame but themselves. That afternoon, I pulled out the old file box from my closet, the one labeled House Papers. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes. Given up. They thought I was weak, old, harmless. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Because when you take everything from a man who's already lost the love of his life, there's not much left he can lose. And that makes him dangerous. They'd learn that soon enough. I told myself the hardest part was getting out, that leaving my own house with a single duffel and a stubborn refusal to argue had been the real test. But leaving was the easy part. The real work started after you decide you're not going to be walked over, after you discover that the people who claim family don't respect the thing that holds up every other part of your life, your home. My little apartment felt smaller the second week. The sheets smelled faintly of bleach from the laundromat down the street, and the building's elevator groaned like an old man each time it climbed to my floor. I woke up at the same time I always had, 6 in the morning, put on my jacket, filled my water bottle, and walked. Walking had always been where I cleared my mind. It let the edges of my anger soften enough for me to think clearly. I wasn't the sort to rush. I'd learned in life that patience was a tool, sharper and more effective than any loud confrontation. The first days I did nothing but watch. I watched their car in the driveway. I watched packages arrive and get carried in. I listened for the sound of my name being misused, the Richards family, as if my identity had been repackaged and sold. A week of watching taught me things. It taught me how people take a house and make it feel like a hotel. Linens swapped for cheaper ones, mugs replaced with mismatched, disposable ones, picture frames removed and thrift store art propped up in their place. It taught me which of my dishes they used daily, my mother's good china, and which of my tools they had no business touching, the old drill with the chewed-up handle I'd used to put up the nursery shelves. Mostly, it taught me how careless entitlement could be, leaving a window open, letting the dog wander off the leash in the yard, parking a truck half on the lawn. Each small disrespect I cataloged. I took notes, real, careful notes, like a man taking inventory of a ship he intended to sail back into calm waters. I wrote times, dates, and truth. Thanks, Jerry, I'd appreciate it. There it was, progress. Another neighbor, another person who remembered how things had been before. The dominoes were slowly lining up. but I didn't want to be the only one pushing them. That afternoon, I did something practical. I found the file box, again, and went through everything with a calm, almost filial reverence. Mortgage statements, property tax receipts, the title deed itself in its velvet envelope, my insurance policy, utility account numbers, the original home warranty documents. I checked the HOA covenants and restrictions like a man reading a script he intended to memorize. The whole house of paper told a story that favored me. It was a small, cold joy to find that every bill for the house was either in my name or remained unpaid. The mortgage was current. The insurance paid through June. HOA fees were historically up to date. That meant I had leverage, and leverage is a funny thing. It doesn't shout, it calculates. I called the insurance conversation, policy numbers, agent names, confirmations. I didn't say more than I needed. I asked questions about what would happen if unauthorized occupants caused damage. The agent gave me the legalese answer and promised to flag the policy. A tiny thing, technical and anonymous, but it warmed me. Better to have more people knowing what was afoot than fewer. Then I called an old friend, Emily, who'd been a paralegal at the firm I'd used years ago. She'd helped me sort out my wife's estate, handled things with a delicate, uncompromising efficiency. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but she picked up on the second ring. "Pete," she said, voice soft but alert. "Everything okay?" "Not really," I said, and then, without dramatics, told her what had happened. Emily didn't laugh. She didn't psychoanalyze. She said, "Do you have the title in your name?" "Yes." "Good," she replied. "Good. You're not the one missing papers. Don't go on the house tonight. Don't change locks. Don't do anything that will look like you're trying to get them out without process. But you need a paper trail. I can draw up a formal notice. They'll have to be served. If they don't leave, that's when you get the sheriff involved. You'll want to document the damage too. Emotion fail them. The thought of it put a dry smile on my face. My wife would have liked this. She always said paperwork made things official. It made emotions accountable. Hired Emily to help, and the first thing she did was draft a notice to vacate, a formal legal document letting anyone living at the house know they had a set number of days to leave or face further action. It wasn't vindictive, just precise. It would be served formally by a professional. I felt a small, controlled pleasure when Emily told me she'd get the notice typed and filed. That night I slept with the notebook under my pillow and the velvet envelope with the title tucked into the side table. While the legal machinery warmed up, because legal machinery takes its time, and that's another reason it's useful, I did other, quieter things. I went back by the house one evening and pretended to be a man out for a walk. I watched the porch lights, the way Cora's father had hung a cheap string of bulbs like some kind of decoration. I noted how they left the back gate open. I paid attention to the names of the cars parked there and the times they came and went. I spoke to the delivery guy who handed over packages. He mentioned deliveries tied to a Cora Richards and a Neil. Simple things, easily corroborated. I also started a ledger of expenses. Every broken tile, every replaced lock. They'd already tried to modernize the front lock with a keypad that had never been authorized. Every missing cushion, everything I could pin a price tag to went into the ledger. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post it online. It was private ammunition, stored in my little apartment like a small, patient arsenal. There were moments of doubt. Late at night, the ache of loneliness would come with a particular clarity. The apartment's single light would hum, and the city would breathe its odd, indifferent lullaby. I'd think about Maria, her laugh, the way she would scold me gently if I sat too long fretting over numbers and notices. She would tell me to keep my dignity, and to remember that dignity isn't a shield against cruelty. It's the reason to act with care. I missed her more than my house some nights. Missing someone teaches you a strange discipline. You act so that absence has a meaning beyond mere sorrow. Called once while Emily was drafting the notice. It was a Thursday. Into silence. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "Talk to her, Neil. Talk to her, and then call me." Welch for 15 minutes about the weather, about the dog, about how the gutters needed cleaning. We didn't speak about the fullness of his complicity, because some confessions aren't easy, and some people don't change on the call. The notice was served 2 days later. I didn't watch it happen. I stayed at the apartment and tried to act as if the butterflies in my stomach were ordinary morning flutters. Emily called me after to say the sheriff's deputy had posted it on the front door. Official, stamped, and impossible to ignore. Service by certified mail was also completed. Now it was in the record. Something odd happened after the notice went up. Instead of confrontation, there was a kind of frantic complacency. The Richards family seemed stunned rather than angry, as if they had believed their own claim to the house was unassailable. Cora cried to a friend over the phone in the driveway. Her mother moved slower, a tremor in her hands when she placed a plate on the counter. Her father drove to the hardware store 2 towns over and came back with armfuls of things that didn't match the house. Potted plants, a rusted wind chime, a doormat that read, "Home Sweet Home." The small performative things people do to convince themselves of permanence. House and saw them sitting at my kitchen table, with cheap coffee and paper cups. I pulled into the shadowed side street and watched them laugh at something on a screen. Something in me wanted to turn my car around, stomp up to the door, and take back the remote by sheer force of habit. Instead, I sat in my car and watched them behave like a family in a house they didn't earn. He kept a careful, legal distance. The sheriff's office told Emily that they couldn't forcibly evict until a judge signed an order if the occupants refused to leave. There was always that old, slow, deliberate arc of the system. It was maddening, but it also suited me. The law is often cumbersome. It's also impartial. If I filled my side of the paperwork, it would be the impartial mechanism that removed them, not some dramatic argument on my porch that the neighbors would remember with the wrong details. I waited. The waiting was the hardest part for people who imagine revenge movies where everything happens in a flurry. Real life doesn't work like that. It's slow. Communications. In the latter, I saved voicemails and transcribed them into printable statements. There were also small mercies. A neighbor named Rosa left a casserole at the door one afternoon with a note. "We miss your roses. Hold steady." It was a small, domestic kindness that felt like an anchor. People noticed. They began to speak to me differently when I drove by. They nodded as if to say, "We see you. You're not invisible." That recognition matters. It's like being given back a piece of your reflection. Misinformation. One evening, as I sorted through the receipts and jotted lines in my ledger, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. This wasn't only about the house. If I was honest, and I always tried to be, I wanted my son to stop being the kind of man who lets others treat his family ill. I wanted Neil to feel the consequence of being indecisive when standing up mattered. That knowledge sat inside me like a new sharp will. If the paperwork and the law taught lessons slowly, so too could humiliation. There's a cold usefulness to humiliation when it's not laced with gratuitous cruelty, when it reveals something people refuse to see. Dismantle part of my plan was quieter and, in its own way, kinder. I made arrangements with a local restoration crew, just in case. Not to renovate for revenge, but to have someone ready to repair damage that would inevitably be blamed on me. If the house came back to me in pieces, I wanted to fix it and move forward, not get bogged down in the mess. Emily approved the choice. "You're thinking ahead," she said without judgment. "That's good. Blackmail before the storm smells like dust and warm paper, a filing cabinet closed and latched. It feels unfair sometimes, this patient architecture of revenge, waiting until the proper forms are filed and the legal steps are followed. But it also feels right. I didn't want to be the kind of man who lost himself in showy acts. I wanted nothing more than to be the kind of man who did things properly, even when he was hurt. On the morning the hearing was scheduled, I woke up before dawn. The sun had not fully climbed above the rooftops, and the world still smelled like sleeping grass. I drank my coffee in the smallest cup I had, the one Maria always used because she said it kept the coffee will be taken care of. Shameful's deputy who served the initial notice had been courteous but blunt. "This is how it goes, sir," he'd said. "If they don't leave, we file for unlawful detainer. The court's schedule. You get your day there. It can be messy, but it makes things official. Missions. Esty is right. But there was an odd thrill in the litigation's predictability. It was the difference between a scenario made of random cruelty and one that had structure. If I was going to be hurt, I would rather be hurt within a system that made the hurt count. That afternoon, as I waited for the clerk to call about the date, Cora posted something on one of those neighborhood apps, an image of the kitchen, the caption reading, "Making this place feel like home." Comments streamed in. Compliments, cat emojis, someone asking about the light fixtures. The post made my stomach drop, but then a neighbor replied underneath, "You're welcome to make it feel like home if you actually live there legally." A small salvo in the comment thread, one that made my phone buzz with a private ping. Another neighbor had taken a screenshot and sent it to me. The digital world had become another place where the story could be set straight. Missions. By the end of the chapter, my little waiting chapter, the pieces were in place. The notice, the ledger, the photos, the neighborly testimonies, Emily's steady hand on the paperwork, and the whisper network of the street who remembered that houses have histories, not just addresses. The trap wasn't violent or theatrical. It was paper and people. It was the slow tributary of law meeting the ocean of community standards and reputation. When I closed my ledger that night, the apartment felt less like a place of exile and more like a planning room. The anger had cooled into a measured certainty. That certainty is a strange thing. Like cold iron, it doesn't glimmer, but it holds. Tomorrow would be another day of waiting. Maybe the sheriff would schedule the court dates sooner than I expected. Maybe they would leave on their own, shamed or simply exhausted. I had given them every chance to be decent. If they failed, the system would record it. I thought about Maria again before I fell asleep. I pictured her in the kitchen of our old house, stirring soup, smiling at something I'd said. She would have liked without consequences. It's a basic truth. It's not dramatic. It's simply true. Lasted as long as it needed to. The storm, when it came, would have to reckon with everything I had collected quietly in the spaces where people think anger fades. They told me the law moves slowly. They were right, but not so slow that it couldn't still surprise you with the finality of its steps, when those steps hit all at once. Therapists called on a gray house, called on a gray Tuesday. The judge has signed an order for an unlawful detainer, the clerk said, voice bland as a vending machine. We've scheduled a hearing, 3 days from now. Service will be completed before then. Please make sure you're available. I thanked her and hung up, the weight in my chest shifting from patient iron to a cold, bright expectation. Immigration. They've scheduled it, I said. She didn't sound surprised. Good, she said. Keep your phone on. Don't go near the house unless accompanied by the deputy. And for God's sake, don't let emotions run your mouth online. Let the record do the talking. That night I slept poorly. Hours slipped through me like coins. I drank more coffee than sensible men should and read through the folder labeled Communications until the words blurred. The ledger stared back at me with neat columns of damage and expense. I ran the totals in my head and tried to imagine what would happen when a judge read the itemized list and the photos and the neighbors' statements. Would it be vindication? Or would it feel shallow, like catching the scent of someone who'd already gone? Morning came bright and sharp. I dressed in a jacket that wasn't new but still respectable. I clipped Emily's note about what to say in my pocket. I tucked the little velvet envelope with the deed into the inside flap where my hand would find it without thinking. The drive to the house was a short one, but every block felt longer than it used to. I passed the bakery where Maria had liked to get a cinnamon roll on Saturdays. I passed the park where Neil used to skateboard. The town was a museum of ordinary things that made up a life. I arrived 30 minutes before the deputy's scheduled appearance. The street was already busier than normal. A few neighbors lingered on their porches like spectators at a slow, legal play. Jerry waved from across the street and mouthed, "Stay calm." Rosa put a casserole dish in my hands, again, and insisted I take it. I accepted it like a talisman. Arrived in an understated cruiser that said, "Law and order without ornament." He was younger than I expected, maybe in his 30s, with care said, in sterile legal language, that the occupants had no lawful right to remain, and that they must vacate by a set time or face forcible removal. Cora was at the kitchen window, hand pressed to the glass. Her eyes were wide and shiny in a way that hadn't been there the week before. Her father paced like a man whose script had been ripped up. Her mother trembled as she clutched a stack of china too tender for the way it had been handled. P-fines. Sexism. Please, Cora said, voice cracking. She buzzed the deputy through the door, pushing the sleeve of the order toward him, like some metaphor for the truth she'd never considered. You don't understand. We thought this would be temporary. You were told to leave, the deputy said, calm and final. You've been given legal notice. If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll provide you with information on where to retrieve personal belongings after a removal. It's a strange feeling to stand outside your own house and watch people you love, or thought you loved, become strangers before your eyes. For a moment, the urge to shout things that would be satisfying but meaningless seized me. I wanted to call out every fond memory, every wrong turn we'd taken as a family. Instead, I breathed slowly and let the law do what I'd arranged it to do. Cora's father lashed out, loud, hot, ugly. You can't just do this, he shouted. This is our home now. You've made a mistake. You were trespassing, the deputy said. Sir, if there's a dispute about ownership, that will be decided by the court. For now, the court has issued an order. Nelson stood on the side of the porch like a man too stunned to choose. He moved to stand by me, and for the first time since all this had started, his eyes met mine cleanly. That look, equal parts apology and fear, was the most painful thing I'd felt so far. I didn't have the energy to hurt him more than the law already would. The deputy assured them there'd be time to gather possessions. We'll allow reasonable access to remove personal belongings under supervision, he said. We'll make an inventory. Please cooperate. Descended into a chaotic coordination that was both sad and oddly bureaucratic. Boxes were packed with the speed of people who'd been jolted awake. Some things were wrapped with care. Others were shoved into tears at one point and flung herself at Neil, as if clinging to him might anchor them. You promised, she sobbed. You promised we could stay. He held her and shook his head slowly. I thought, he started, then stopped. He had no language for his own complicity, and so he offered none. While they packed, the deputy and I performed the inventory. He checked items, made notes. He asked names to confirm who owned what. I made no attempt to claim what was theirs. I only watched for damages and made sure nothing was misrepresented. When he called out items that had been damaged, scratched wood, broken fixtures, I added them to the ledger. They listed things I hadn't noticed: holes in the lawn from a backyard project that had gone awry, an unauthorized shed bolted to the fence, rust stains on the gutters where a fountain had been installed without permits. Shimmer's father got aggressive and tried to bar the deputy from touching a box he insisted held family heirlooms. The deputy calmly informed him that anything that appeared to be structurally attached or altered without permission would be subject to documentation, and the man's argument dissolved into something shamefaced and muttered. By noon, the driveway looked like a yard sale after the customers had gone. Cars stained the street as personal items were loaded. There were things that made my chest twist with an odd, vindicated sorrow. A faded baseball cap Neil had from when he was 10. A chipped plate painted by a neighbor's kid. The old toolbox where I kept the first wrench I'd bought the year I met Maria. Cora's mother tried to stop a young man from hauling away a bedside table I'd built myself. That belonged to your grandfather, she protested. Obierno. It belonged to me, I said simply. There was a pause that felt like a verdict. The mother's face flushed something like guilt mixed with embarrassment. She moved on. People whispered as if moral currencies were being counted aloud. Can you believe they did this? How could they move in without asking? A few neighbors crossed the street to exchange condolences. A woman I'd never met hugged me for a long time and said, I'm so sorry, we didn't know. When the last box was packed and the last car drove away, they sat on the curb with 2 suitcases and a look that seemed both bewildered and diminished. Could smell the cigarette he had smoked while waiting in his car. That smell stung with disappointment. Dad, he said, voice small, I'm sorry, I didn't know what to do. You could have called me. I answered. You could have told me you were allowing strangers to live in my house. You could have asked. You could have told the truth. He looked older in that moment than he had in years. There's a particular kind of burden that lands on a person when their child learns a lesson the hard way. It isn't pleasure. It isn't triumph. It's a quiet, necessary clarity. Dad, what will happen next? He asked. We'll file for damages, I said. We'll let the court decide. We'll let the neighbors speak for what they saw. We'll fix what needs fixing. And you'll learn what it means to be responsible for your family. He nodded like a man who might, finally, begin that work. The neighbors helped move things back in, as if to stitch the house's edges back together. Rosa brought soup. Jerry fixed a sagging hinge on the back gate. People offered to repair the fence at cost. Even the HOA president came by and said quietly, "We'll discount the fines if you file with receipts proving the damages." Community is subtle sometimes. It arrives in offers and logistics rather than grand speeches. There were legal follow-ups. Emily instructed me to file a claim for damages, and she prepared the affidavits. We presented the ledger to the court along with photographs and neighbor statements. The judge didn't shout in a cinematic courtroom. He read the documents with a sober attention that made the words feel like a scale balancing. When he awarded damages, costs for the unauthorized alterations, fines and restoration fees, I felt no gloating. I felt only the exhale of someone who'd been listened to by the impartial machinery he'd trusted. And her parents disputed some of it, of course. They claimed some items were purchased by them, that other damages were pre-existing. The back and forth could have devolved into petty lies, but most people who lie that much tend to trip on their own details. Their claims weren't supported by receipts or witnesses. The judge's ruling, when it finally arrived, was precise and clinical. Reimbursements for verified damages, court costs, and an order barring them from returning to the property without my express written consent. House looked like itself again. The sofa back in place, the lamp where it belonged, the picture frames returned. The mesquite tree still stood, pruned and stubborn. I walked through each room slowly, touching surfaces with reverent hands. The house didn't feel like mine in the triumphant sense. It felt like a place where wounds had been acknowledged and a stitch had been sewn. I had not conquered anyone. I'd reclaimed what was mine. Implush. Me that evening as we went through the restoration list. He listened when I explained why certain things mattered. The picture frames that held our birthdays. The herb garden my wife had planted that needed replanting. The patched roof shingles that had to be replaced. His hands were clumsy at first, but steady. Every small repair he made felt like a confession without words. We spoke quietly over cold pizza in the kitchen. He told me about the pressure that had pushed him, how Cora's parents had been charming in front of her until they were not, how he'd been afraid to lose them as a family if he objected. I didn't want to be the bad guy, he said. I thought I was doing the right thing. Disillusion. Doing the right thing sometimes looks different than you think, I said. Being the good guy sometimes means being the hard one. He looked at me for a long time, as if measuring whether he could become that man. I don't know if he will be, not yet. But he was present in a way he hadn't been for weeks. That presence mattered more than any judgment I could levy. Emma. The Richards family moved away within a month. They sold some things at a loss and packed the rest into a small U-Haul. I gave them the phone number of a local counselor, not as punishment, but because I recognized the pattern of entitlement that sometimes masks a deeper desperation. I did not gloat when the moving truck disappeared down the street. I didn't feel much like celebrating. What I felt was a tired peace. Symmetry. That night I sat in my recliner, the one I'd missed, and drank tea that Maria would have considered too weak. The lamp cast a soft glow over photographs that now seemed to shine with a little more meaning. I ran a hand over the arm of the chair and felt the familiar worn patch where years of use had smoothed the fabric. I had won by the slow, quiet law of process, not by spectacle, not little drama. There would be bills to pay and repairs to finish. There would be an awkwardness between Neil and his ex-in-laws if we ever crossed paths. There would be small, quiet conversations about choices and the kind of man Neil wanted to become. But none of that could happen until the dust settled. Eviction day had been the hard, necessary cut. The rest would be the stitching. And if I'd learned anything in those slow months, it was that stitches, though not as exciting as fireworks, are what hold things together in the long run. Championship. I turned off the lamp, feeling the tired ache of a day that always feels longer when justice arrives. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with ordinary life. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Somewhere else, a couple argued softly in a car. Life continued, indifferent and persistent. Crimson. Seizing night with the deed by my bedside and a small, steady understanding that when you set a boundary and keep it, not out of spite but out of reason, you don't just defend a house. You teach the people inside it what it means to be family. Tomorrow there would be invoices and calls and repairs, but tonight my home was quiet, and that was enough. There's a peculiar quiet that follows the kind of upheaval I'd set into motion. It isn't the loud silence of an empty house, no dramatic echo of footsteps and doors swinging on hinges. It's a softer thing. The small noises of repair, the polite clearing of invoices from a kitchen table, neighbors coming and going with tools and casseroles. The world keeps its ordinary rhythms, and you learn to fit your grief and your satisfaction into the spaces between them. The judge's ruling, the practical work began. Paperwork, repairs, receipts, calls to insurance companies, and the grind of restoration. Emily did the heavy legal lifting, filing motions, confirming the damages, getting the court's order enforced when necessary. Her presence was like an umbrella in a storm, necessary, unobtrusive, and oddly consoling. When she hung up after a long call with the county clerk, she said only, "You did everything by the book. Now we'll make sure the book holds." Crimson. I spent the next weeks moving from one repair to the next. The restoration crew I'd prearranged showed up with polite professional, fixed the back gate, treated the mesquite tree for proper pruning, and sanded down the coffee table that had been scuffed during their temporary stay. When he made small, fumbling jokes about how he'd been a poor tenant, I laughed with him rather than at him. That laugh felt like a stitch. We patched the hole in the fence together. He held the board while I drilled. His hands were steadier than I expected. He'd always been good at mechanical things, circuit boards and little engines, and it turned out fixing our home gave him a clarity he hadn't shown in other aspects of his life. After we finished, he went inside and started clearing boxes with a focus I hadn't seen in years. It felt right that the son who'd let matters slide was now the one holding the broom. Sentenced in small ways when they're forced into the light of consequence. Cora's parents, for their part, seemed suddenly smaller, their swagger replaced with the shame that comes when you have to explain yourself to neighbors who had once admired you. Word travels fast in a neighborhood. Some folks whispered that they'd lost a lot in selling their place quickly. Others said the truth was simpler. An attitude that made people assume entitlement was a birthright rather than something you earn with kindness and time. They did not return. The court order made it clear. They were prohibited from coming onto the property without written permission. That didn't stop the rumor mill. There were stories, some true, some embellished, about repossessed furniture, about attempts to sell a few pieces at a loss. There was the inevitable social cost, too. A few community members who'd once smiled at the Richards family now looked away when they met them at the market. Reputation is a fragile currency. When you spend it carelessly, it's gone. Cora called once, from a number I recognized, but I didn't pick up. Neil told me later he'd texted her to say the judge had been fair and that he'd regret his choices. She'd replied with something I didn't want to read. People will always have reasons, some sincere, some not, if you let them explain away their behavior. Sometimes the truth isn't what you hear from them, but what you see in the quiet aftermath. There were practicalities to navigate beyond the repairs. The HOA required documentation of all fines and fix-ups. The insurance wanted receipts. Neighbors filed affidavits about noise and unauthorized change. Parents looking at me and seeing the years instead of a target. That didn't happen in the way I'd fantasized. The apologies that did arrive were clumsy and small. Neil offered one that was long and earnest, and I accepted it because I could see the change beginning. The others, less sincere, perhaps transactional, landed like playing cards on a table I'd already cleared. One afternoon, a letter arrived that surprised me. It was from Cora's mother. She wrote in a cramped hand, the kind women use when putting things down carefully. The letter wasn't a grand confession or a plea. It was a paragraph of humility and an offer. She wrote that they'd overstepped, that pride had made them greedy, and that she was sorry for the damage done to my home, and more importantly to my family. She enclosed a check, small by the ledger's standards but meaningful because she'd made the gesture. She asked only for forgiveness and a promise that Neil would not be ostracized for the mistake he'd made. That letter mattered more than the court could award. It wasn't a dramatic spectacle. It was honesty in an envelope. I sat at my kitchen table and read it 3 times before I tucked it into a drawer where I kept the smaller relics of our life. Old movie tickets, a pressed leaf from the tree Maria and I planted at the hospital the day Neil was born. I'd met vengeance with paperwork, but forgiveness required a different muscle. I wasn't eager to exercise it for the sake of absolving them quickly. I wanted Neil to learn that forgiveness is a thing you give when someone shows they'll not repeat their mistake. We rebuilt the garden the way Maria used to like it. I planted basil, rosemary, and chives where she'd like to find them in the winter sun. Neil helped, kneeling in the dirt, asking more thoughtful questions about pruning than he had business sense a few months earlier. The herb bed became a sort of altar of continuity, a way to stitch the past to the present. People in the neighborhood slowly resumed their ordinary kindnesses. Rosa stopped by with cookies and news about the local community center. Jerry offered me a beer and an honest chat about how he'd never realized how much he took the little things for granted, like one's own name on a mailbox. The simple, neighborly acts showed me the other kind of currency, the one you earn by being seen and recognized. The hardest part of therapy. Men his age often do, balking at anything that seems like a weakness. But after a particularly long night of him talking, tears and all, he agreed to try. Therapy did strange things for him. He began to talk about choices and fear, how he'd been afraid of being seen as the bad guy by the people who'd pressured him. He confessed to me, in a voice raw with regret, that he'd always been conflict-averse, afraid that asserting himself would undo something he couldn't imagine selling back. We talked about courage and small acts of integrity. He began to see that standing firm isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's what protects the ones you love. One afternoon, he came to me with a small wrapped box. "Dad," he said, eyes earnest, "I want you to have this." Inside was a photo frame he'd found while cleaning the garage. It was old, but the wood was warm where hands had held it for years. Inside, he'd placed a picture of the 3 of us, Maria, Neil, and myself, taken on a 4th of July when the sun had been bright and reckless, and we'd all been young enough to believe in endless summers. He'd sanded the frame, stained it, and fixed the glass. "I wanted to make something right," he said. I put the frame on the mantel next to Maria's picture and felt a little of the weight lift. I won't pretend that everything smoothed out like a commercial. There were awkward grocery store run-ins with Cora's parents. Hello and quickly averted eyes. There were times when I caught myself replaying their arrogant words in my head and feeling old sparks of anger. But those moments passed quicker than they used to. I learned to breathe and redirect that energy into mowing the lawn or calling Emily to check a document. One of the more surprising outcomes came from the community itself. The HOA, which had been irritated and ready with penalties, saw the receipts and neighbor affidavits and recommended we institute an information sheet for new owners and occupants of about the neighborhood code, what to expect and what not to do. The little pamphlet suggested courtesy calls before hosting loud gatherings, and a reminder that permission was more than a courtesy when it involved someone else's property. I helped draft it with a neighbor who'd had a background in municipal planning. It felt small, but meaningful. A preventative measure born from a messy ordeal. Months wanted it to be civilized. I wanted to show that I wasn't acting out of malice but aiming for closure. She arrived late, hair in a messy bun, eyes rimmed with tiredness. She sat across from me with hands folded like a student about to be graded. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen," she said, voice low. I thought my parents were only going to be here for a short while. I'm sorry for how it made you feel. Shoreline, I said, but you can't assume you can press your presence into other people's lives and expect them to rearrange their history around you. That's a lesson we both learned the hard way. Jeopardy. And then she surprised me by saying, I lost more than I thought I would. People don't forget quickly here. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. Silence her apology was not all I'd wanted, but it was something. She'd been reckless in an entitled way, and she owned a piece of that reckoning. We spoke for a while about boundaries, about pride and humility, and about the kind of man Neil could be if he decided to be accountable from now on. When she left, she hugged me briefly, awkward, sincere, and walked away. Revenge had been the initial impulse, if I'm honest. I wanted to respond to the disrespect with something that would sting, but as the months wore on and the adrenaline cooled, I saw the better path. To make the lesson last, not through hate, but through the slow arithmetic of consequences and the patient work of repair. I wanted them to learn, to be better, not just to be punished. Shoreline. There were still nights when the house felt heavy with memory. I would go to bed and wake up thinking of Maria, how she would have told me to be kinder even when I was right. There was a part of me that missed the old life in ways that made me ache. So I honored that ache by doing small, practical things that reminded me of her. Cooking the soup she used to make, watering the roses she planted, and dusting her favorite chair. Imprisonment. One afternoon, as summer tipped toward fall, a young couple knocked on my door. They were new to the neighborhood, bright-eyed, apologetic about the porch light they'd left on, and curious about the little herb garden. I invited them in. We talked about the neighborhood, about where to find a good plumber, about Mrs. Alvarez who made the best. We knelt in the dirt together, fingers cold and willing. He put his hand on my shoulder and said simply, "Thanks, Dad." There was no fanfare behind the words, only clean gratitude that felt as honest as any accolade. I put a small stone by the plant with Maria's name on it. The rose bush won't bloom forever, and the people we tangled with will go on with their lives, carrying what they learned or didn't learn. But whenever I look at that bush, when it catches the sun and opens into those stubborn, fragrant blooms, I think about what matters, boundaries that protect dignity, the slow work of repair, and the way people can, if given the chance, choose to be better. If there's a moral to tell, it's this. Standing up for yourself needn't make you cruel. Standing up for yourself can be steady and just. You can reclaim what is yours and still keep your humanity. That, ultimately, is the kind of lesson that matters most, not for drama, but for the quiet work of living. When the repairs were done and the last invoice paid, I sat in my favorite chair and listened to the house. Real listening, the kind that hears the creak of a floorboard and remembers a laugh. Neil came in with 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me. We didn't need to talk. We were home. I took a breath and tasted the air, the faint salt of the desert, the scent of rosemary in the window, the soft beat of the neighborhood settling into evening. The storm had passed. The stitching had held. And in the space that remained, there was room to be kind again.